Nestled in the heart of Kansas, the Thompson farm sprawled across acres of fertile plains, where golden wheat fields swayed in the breeze and clusters of oak trees offered shade from the scorching summer sun. The farm was a testament to decades of hard work by Jack Thompson and his wife, Mary. Jack, a tall man with weathered skin and a streak of gray in his dark hair, had the firm handshake of someone accustomed to hard labor. Mary, shorter and softer in appearance but equally tough, was the glue that held the family and the farm together. Their days started before the sun rose. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the modest farmhouse each morning, where photos of family and animals lined the walls. Outside, the barn was a hub of activity. Sheep bleated from the pens, chickens scratched at the dirt, and in the far stall stood Rocky, their loyal Mustang. With his chestnut coat and white blaze running down his face, Rocky was the pride of the farm. Jack often said, "He's more than a horse. He's family." Rocky had come to the Thompsons by chance. Years ago, Jack had spotted him at a rescue shelter, malnourished and skittish. It took months of patience and care to gain the horse's trust, but now Rocky was a steadfast companion. Whether pulling a plow or standing watch over the fields, he was an integral part of farm life. "You always know when Rocky's around," Mary often joked. "He has a presence." The farm itself was humble but full of life. The main barn, painted a fading red, stood against the backdrop of endless skies. Inside, the air smelled of hay and leather, mingled with the earthy scent of animals. Jack had built much of it himself, with Rocky by his side. "It's not just a barn," he'd say. "It's our livelihood." The Thompsons' days followed a steady rhythm. Jack spent hours in the fields or repairing equipment, while Mary managed the household and cared for the sheep. In the evenings, they sat on the porch swing, sipping sweet tea and watching the sun dip below the horizon. "Life's simple, but it's ours," Jack often remarked, his eyes scanning the horizon as if looking for storms to come. Their neighbors respected them, though visits were infrequent. The Thompsons were known for their independence. "Jack can fix just about anything," their nearest neighbor, Carl, had said once. "And Mary's the kind of woman who'd wrestle a coyote if it came to her flock." For all its serenity, the farm was not without challenges. Predators occasionally prowled the outskirts, and the harsh Kansas weather often tested their resilience. But Jack and Mary faced every trial together, leaning on the quiet strength they'd cultivated over years of partnership. Rocky was often a source of comfort during tough times. Jack had a habit of talking to the horse as if he understood every word. "You've got to pull your weight, boy," he'd say with a chuckle, brushing Rocky's coat. The horse would respond with a gentle nuzzle, as if acknowledging his part in the farm's survival. Life on the Thompson farm was steady, predictable, and deeply fulfilling. Jack and Mary found joy in their routines, pride in their work, and comfort in the companionship of their animals. But the peace they cherished would soon be disrupted, as an unexpected mystery began to unfold. A mystery that would test their trust in Rocky and each other. The chill of a Kansas winter morning clung to the air as Jack stepped out of the farmhouse, the sky painted in hues of gray and orange. His boots crunched against the frost-covered ground as he made his way to the sheep pens, the breath from his nose forming small clouds in the frigid air. Morning chores awaited, and Jack welcomed the routine. As he approached the pen, something immediately felt off. The sheep were huddled tightly together, bleating nervously. Jack frowned and quickened his pace. His heart sank when he reached the gate and began counting the lambs. One was missing. "Mary!" Jack's voice carried back toward the farmhouse. Mary, who had been feeding the chickens, looked up, concern already written on her face. "What is it?" she called, wiping her hands on her apron as she hurried over. "One of the lambs is gone," Jack said grimly, pointing to the empty space near the trough where the missing lamb had been lying just the night before. Mary's brow furrowed. "Gone? How? The pen's secure, isn't it?" Jack nodded. "Checked it myself last night. No way it could have just wandered off." He ran a hand through his graying hair, frustration creeping in. Predators maybe, but there's no sign of a struggle. No tracks. Nothing. The two of them inspected the pen closely. The fence was intact, the gate locked tight. Jack's eyes roamed the ground, searching for any clue. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Coyotes would have left something behind. Tracks, fur, blood, anything." Mary crouched beside the pen, her eyes scanning the frozen dirt. "Could someone have taken it?" she asked, her voice low as though speaking the possibility might make it true. Jack shook his head. "Who'd steal a lamb from us? And why?" The thought unsettled him. Their farm had always been a place of safety and trust. The idea of someone intruding on that space was almost harder to believe than the lamb vanishing into thin air. As the morning wore on, Jack and Mary expanded their search, checking the nearby fields and tree line. The wind whispered through the tall grass, but there was no sign of the missing lamb. By mid-morning, Jack stood with his hands on his hips, staring out over the pastures, his jaw clenched. "This doesn't feel right," he said finally, turning to Mary. "Something's going on, and I don't like it." Mary placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We'll figure it out, Jack. Maybe it's just a one-time thing. Let's not jump to conclusions." But Jack couldn't shake the unease that settled in his chest. That night, as the sky darkened and the cold seeped into the walls of the farmhouse, he found himself staring out the window toward the sheep pens. Rocky stood in the nearby paddock, his large frame silhouetted against the moonlight. The horse seemed calm, unbothered by the day's events. "You think Rocky saw something?" Mary asked from behind him, startling Jack from his thoughts. She handed him a cup of coffee and joined him by the window. "Don't know," Jack admitted. "If he did, he didn't let on." Mary sipped her coffee, her face thoughtful. "Well, let's keep an eye on things. Maybe whatever it was won't come back." Jack nodded, though he wasn't convinced. He couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something much larger. As he climbed into bed that night, his thoughts lingered on the empty spot in the sheep pen and the strange silence that surrounded the farm. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely sound that seemed to echo Jack's growing unease. The next morning brought a bitter wind that howled through the Kansas plains. Jack bundled up in his thick coat and gloves, his breath steaming in the cold air as he stepped out to begin his day. The sunrise cast long shadows across the farm, but Jack's focus was on the sheep pen. He had hardly slept, his thoughts consumed by the strange disappearance of the lamb. As he approached the pen, his stomach sank. Another lamb was missing. "Mary," he called, his voice sharp with urgency. Mary, still inside the house, dropped the basket of laundry she was carrying and rushed out, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "What is it this time?" she asked, her face pale. "Another one's gone," Jack said, pointing to the same pen where yesterday's mystery had unfolded. "This isn't just a fluke. Something, or someone, is taking them." Mary's expression turned grim. "Jack, this isn't normal. 2 lambs in 2 days? We've never had this kind of trouble before." Jack leaned on the pen's gate, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. No tracks again. No sign of a break-in. It's like they vanished into thin air. The sheep in the pen seemed more agitated than usual, their bleating louder and more frantic. Jack moved among them, checking each one for injuries or signs of distress. His heart ached at the thought of another lamb gone, and a sense of helplessness gnawed at him. Later that day, Jack decided to consult Carl, their neighbor who lived a mile down the road. Carl, a burly man with a thick beard and a booming voice, had been farming in the area for decades. If anyone could provide insight, it was him. 2 lambs in 2 days, you say? Carl asked, leaning against the fence post on his property. His brow furrowed as he considered Jack's story. That's strange, all right. Coyotes are a possibility, but they're messy. You'd have found something. Jack nodded. Exactly. No tracks, no signs of a struggle. And the pen's secure. Carl scratched his head. Could be a two-legged predator, if you know what I mean. Had trouble with poachers a couple of years back, but nothing like this. You should set up some lights or maybe a trail camera. That's a good idea, Jack admitted. Thanks, Carl. That evening, Jack rigged up a motion-activated light near the sheep pen and borrowed a trail camera from Carl. He felt a flicker of hope that the mystery might soon be solved. Mary watched him work from the kitchen window, worry etched into her face. Do you really think this will catch whatever's out there? She asked as he came inside, his cheeks red from the cold. It's worth a shot, Jack said, though his tone betrayed his doubt. If nothing else, it'll give us some answers. The night passed uneventfully, but when Jack checked the pen at dawn, his worst fears were realized. Another lamb was gone. The light hadn't been triggered, and the trail camera revealed nothing but the usual rustling of sheep in the darkness. Mary found him standing by the pen, his shoulders slumped. Jack, she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. I don't understand it, Mary, he said, his voice heavy with frustration. How can something take them without leaving a trace? We'll figure this out, Mary assured him, though her own unease was evident. Maybe we should call the sheriff. If it's someone stealing them, they need to know. Jack hesitated. He wasn't one to involve authorities unless absolutely necessary. But Mary had a point. This wasn't just a random occurrence. It was a pattern. And patterns like this rarely ended on their own. All right, he said finally. I'll call. But I'm not giving up on finding out what's going on here. As the day wore on, the Thompsons couldn't shake the sense that something larger was at play. Jack worked silently in the barn, his mind churning over the possibilities, while Mary kept a close eye on the sheep. Rocky, sensing the tension, paced restlessly in his paddock, occasionally letting out a low whinny. That night, as the wind howled outside, Jack and Mary lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the farmhouse. Whatever, or whoever, was taking their lambs was out there, and the mystery was far from over. The following morning dawned gray and bitterly cold, with frost glistening like shards of glass across the farm. Jack bundled up as usual and trudged toward the sheep pen. His breath clouded in the frigid air, but his heart felt heavier than ever. The missing lambs had turned their once peaceful life into a source of endless anxiety. Mary stood by the window, watching Jack. She knew he felt responsible for the farm's safety and the livelihood it represented, but she could see the toll the disappearances were taking on him. Gathering her resolve, she pulled on her coat and stepped outside. Anything? She asked as she joined Jack by the pen. Jack shook his head. No more missing, thank God, but I still don't have a clue what's going on. Mary glanced toward Rocky's paddock, where the chestnut horse stood quietly, his breath rising in puffs of steam. Something about his demeanor seemed off. She frowned and nudged Jack. Have you noticed Rocky acting strange lately? Jack looked at her, puzzled. Strange how? Look at him, Mary said, gesturing toward the horse. He's been pacing, and doesn't he look bigger? His belly looks swollen. Jack's brow furrowed as he studied Rocky. He's been eating fine, but now that you mention it, he hasn't been his usual self. Maybe he's just stressed with all the tension around here. Mary crossed her arms, her voice laced with hesitation. Jack, do you think Rocky could have something to do with the lambs? Jack stiffened, his face darkening. Mary, you can't be serious. Rocky's been with us for years. He'd never harm a lamb. I'm not saying he hurt them, Mary said quickly, sensing his rising frustration. But maybe he's, I don't know, somehow involved. Look at him. Jack sighed deeply, torn between loyalty to his horse and the unsettling possibility Mary was suggesting. Fine, I'll take a closer look. He approached Rocky, who greeted him with a soft nicker. Hey, boy, Jack murmured, running a hand down the horse's neck. What's going on with you, huh? As he checked Rocky over, something caught his eye. A tuft of wool stuck in the corner of the horse's mouth. Jack froze, his stomach churning. He gently pulled the wool free and turned it over in his fingers. Mary, he called, his voice tight. She hurried over, her eyes widening as she saw what he held. "That's from the lambs, isn't it?" Jack nodded, his jaw set. "Looks like it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jack felt a pang of guilt as he stared into Rocky's large, trusting eyes. Could the horse he'd raised and cared for be connected to the missing lambs? The thought seemed absurd, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. "What do we do now?" Mary asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack exhaled sharply. "I don't know, but I'm not jumping to conclusions. Maybe there's an explanation we're not seeing." That evening, the tension in the farmhouse was palpable. Mary prepared dinner in silence, her mind racing, while Jack sat at the table, staring at the tuft of wool as if it held the answers he desperately sought. Even Rocky, usually calm and steady, seemed restless, pacing his paddock and letting out the occasional anxious whinny. "I think we need to keep a closer watch tonight," Jack finally said, breaking the silence. Mary nodded. "Agreed. Let's take turns staying up and keeping an eye on things. If Rocky's involved, we'll see it. And if it's something or someone else, we'll know that too." That night, as the farm settled into uneasy quiet, Jack and Mary took turns watching from the window. The motion-activated light near the sheep pen cast long, eerie shadows whenever the wind swayed the trees. Rocky stood near the paddock gate, his ears flicking toward the slightest sound. Hours passed without incident, but the unease lingered. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the farm was on the brink of revealing a truth he wasn't ready to face. Whatever that truth was, it would soon come to light, and it would change everything. The following morning arrived with a stark clarity, the sunlight glinting off the frost-covered fields as if to mock the heaviness that hung over the Thompson farm. Jack emerged from the house, the tuft of wool still tucked in his pocket. Mary followed closely, her arms crossed tightly against the cold, and perhaps against the tension that had been building between them. They worked in silence, each tending to their respective chores. Jack was methodical, his every action slowed by the weight of uncertainty. Mary, usually cheerful and humming a tune as she worked, seemed preoccupied, her movements brisk and clipped. It was Mary who finally broke the silence. "Jack," she said, her voice firm but hesitant, "we can't ignore this anymore. You saw the wool. Rocky's belly is swollen. The pieces fit, whether we like it or not." Jack stopped mid-step, turning to face her. "Are you seriously accusing Rocky of, what, eating the lambs?" "That's ridiculous, Mary." "I didn't say eating," Mary replied, her voice rising slightly. "But something's not right, Jack. Maybe he's moving them, scaring them off, I don't know. But we can't just pretend everything's fine." Jack's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "That horse has been nothing but loyal to this farm. To us. You think I'd let anything harm the lambs? You think I don't care?" "Of course you care," Mary snapped back, her cheeks flushed with frustration. "But caring doesn't mean turning a blind eye. We have to face the facts, Jack, even if it's hard." The tension crackled between them, an unspoken fear simmering beneath their words. Jack turned away, unable to look at Mary's determined face any longer. He walked toward Rocky's paddock, where the horse stood watching, his ears perked as if sensing the strain between his owners. Jack leaned on the paddock fence, his voice low as he spoke to the horse. "You didn't do this, did you, boy? You'd never hurt the lambs." "I know you wouldn't." Rocky nickered softly, his dark eyes meeting Jack's. It was as if he were pleading for Jack to understand, to believe in him despite the mounting evidence. Mary approached cautiously, her voice gentler now. "Jack, I'm not saying we need to make a decision right this minute, but we have to keep an open mind. Maybe there's something going on with Rocky that we don't understand." Jack sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. "Fine, we'll call the vet. Get him checked out. But until then, I don't want to hear another word about Rocky being guilty." "Agreed," Mary said, though the tension in her voice suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Later that day, Jack made the call to Dr. Harris, the local veterinarian, who promised to come by the following morning. Until then, the Thompsons kept a wary eye on Rocky and the sheep, their conversations reduced to strained whispers. That night, the farmhouse was eerily quiet. Jack sat by the window, his rifle leaning against the wall nearby, just in case. Mary paced the kitchen, her thoughts racing. She hated the distance that had grown between her and Jack, but she couldn't shake her unease about Rocky. As midnight approached, Jack finally spoke. "I'll stay up tonight. You get some rest." Mary hesitated but nodded. "All right, but wake me if anything happens." She climbed the stairs, her footsteps heavy, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts. Outside, the farm seemed peaceful, the sheep settled and Rocky standing calmly in his paddock. But the unease lingered, a silent presence that neither Jack nor Mary could ignore. The moon hung high in the cold Kansas sky, casting a pale silver light over the farm. Jack sat by the window, his rifle within reach, and his eyes fixed on the sheep pen. The silence of the night was broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind and the soft bleating of the sheep. His thoughts swirled, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him. Around midnight, Jack's attention snapped to movement near the pen. At first, it was just a shadow, a fleeting disturbance in the stillness. Then came the unmistakable sound of shuffling, followed by the sheep stirring anxiously. Jack's heart pounded as he grabbed his rifle and slipped on his boots. "Mary," he called in a low, urgent tone. He didn't wait for her to respond as he headed for the door. Mary was awake instantly, pulling on her coat as she hurried after him. "What is it?" she whispered. "Something's out there," Jack replied, his voice taut with tension. He pointed toward the sheep pen, where a figure was now visible, crouching low and moving carefully among the animals. "Stay behind me," Jack instructed, his voice firm but quiet. Mary nodded, clutching a flashlight as they approached the pen. "Who's there?" Jack barked, raising his rifle. The figure froze, then bolted toward the fence. Jack was quick to react, leveling the rifle and shouting, "Stop right there, or I'll shoot." The intruder hesitated, clearly weighing their options, before raising their hands in surrender. Jack motioned for Mary to shine the flashlight, revealing a disheveled young man in his early 20s, wearing a threadbare jacket and muddy boots. He looked more frightened than threatening. "What the hell are you doing on my farm?" Jack demanded, his voice sharp and unyielding. I wasn't going to hurt anything," the man stammered, his breath visible in the cold night air. "I just needed the lambs." "Please, let me explain." Mary stepped forward, her flashlight steady on the man's face. "Explain, then," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Jack and Mary. "My name's Lucas. I just moved in down the road. I lost everything back home and came here to start over. I was desperate. I thought if I could take a few lambs, raise them, I could." "Stealing from us isn't starting over," Jack interrupted, his voice laced with anger. "It's trespassing, and it's illegal." "I know," Lucas said, his voice breaking. "I know, and I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I was just trying to survive." Jack's grip on the rifle tightened as he glared at the man. "You've been taking lambs all week? What else have you done? What about my horse? Did you hurt him?" "No," Lucas exclaimed, shaking his head vehemently. "Rocky tried to stop me. He grabbed the lamb with his mouth and wouldn't let go. That's why you found the wool. I swear, I didn't hurt him." Jack's anger faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion and disbelief. "Rocky was protecting the lambs?" Lucas nodded, his expression earnest. "He's a smart horse. Too smart for me to fool. I barely managed to get past him the first time." Mary exchanged a look with Jack, her features softening slightly. "Jack, maybe we should call the sheriff," she suggested quietly. Jack hesitated, his eyes locked on Lucas. The man's trembling hands and pleading expression spoke volumes. Finally, Jack lowered the rifle, though his posture remained stiff. "Go to the house," Jack said to Mary. "Call the sheriff. Tell him we've got someone here he needs to talk to." Mary nodded and hurried back toward the farmhouse. Jack turned his attention back to Lucas. "You stay right there," he ordered. "We're going to let the law handle this." Lucas nodded, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his actions sank in. Jack stood watch, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. The mystery of the missing lambs was solved, but the night was far from over. The faint red and blue lights of the sheriff's vehicle flickered against the dark Kansas night as it approached the farm. Jack stood by the sheep pen, rifle resting on his shoulder, keeping a watchful eye on Lucas. Mary waited near the farmhouse, her arms wrapped tightly around herself to stave off the cold. Though the immediate danger seemed to have passed, the tension in the air was thick. Sheriff Randall stepped out of the car, his imposing frame silhouetted against the headlights. A middle-aged man with a graying mustache and a no-nonsense demeanor, Randall had known Jack and Mary for years. "Evening, Jack." "Mary," the sheriff greeted, nodding at them before turning his steely gaze to Lucas. "So, this is the troublemaker?" "That's him," Jack replied, motioning toward Lucas, who stood frozen in place, his head bowed. "Caught him sneaking into the pen tonight. He admitted to taking the lambs." Sheriff Randall approached Lucas, his boots crunching on the frosty ground. "What's your name, son?" he asked, his tone firm but not unkind. "Lucas," the young man mumbled, his voice barely audible. "Lucas Carter." "Well, Lucas Carter," Randall said, crossing his arms. "Mind telling me what you're doing on the Thompson farm in the middle of the night?" Lucas hesitated, glancing nervously at Jack before speaking. I moved here a few months ago. I lost everything back in Arkansas, my job, my family. I thought I could start over here, but I didn't have the money for livestock. I thought if I could take a few lambs, I could raise them, maybe sell some wool. I didn't mean to cause any harm." Jack's jaw tightened, but Mary stepped closer to him, her hand lightly touching his arm. Her expression was thoughtful, her earlier anger replaced by a mixture of sympathy and frustration. Sheriff Randall sighed, shaking his head. "Starting over doesn't mean stealing, son. You're lucky Jack didn't decide to handle this with more than just a warning shot." Lucas flinched at the words, his shoulders slumping further. "I know," he said softly. "I was desperate. I didn't know what else to do." Jack's grip on his rifle tightened, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the young man. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but laced with disappointment. "Desperation doesn't give you the right to take what isn't yours. You've put my family and this farm through hell this past week." "I'm sorry," Lucas said, his voice breaking. "I really am." Sheriff Randall pulled out a pair of handcuffs, the cold metal glinting in the moonlight. "Lucas Carter, I'm placing you under arrest for trespassing and theft. You'll have your chance to explain yourself to the judge." As the sheriff cuffed Lucas and led him toward the patrol car, Mary stepped forward. "Wait," she said, her voice clear but hesitant. Randall paused, looking back at her. "Something you want to say, Mary?" She glanced at Jack, who nodded reluctantly, before addressing Lucas. "We don't excuse what you did, Lucas. But if you truly want to start over, maybe there's a better way than this. After you've paid for what you've done, you can come back here. We'll see if there's work for you." "Honest work?" Lucas looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You'd give me a chance? After everything I've done?" Mary nodded firmly. "Everyone deserves a chance to make things right. But you'll have to earn it." Jack gave a curt nod, though his expression remained guarded. "She means it. But don't think for a second it'll be easy." Sheriff Randall looked between them, his brow raised, but he didn't argue. "That's mighty generous of you, Mary. For now, though, Lucas is coming with me." As the patrol car pulled away, its red and blue lights disappearing into the distance, the farm fell quiet once more. Jack and Mary stood side by side, the weight of the night settling over them. "You sure about that, Mary?" Jack asked after a moment. She looked up at him, her expression resolute. "Sometimes people need a little kindness to turn their lives around. If he's willing to put in the work, maybe we can help him find a better path." Jack sighed, his hand brushing against Rocky's mane as the horse ambled over to them. "Let's hope you're right." The days following Lucas's arrest brought a much-needed calm to the Thompson farm. The nights no longer carried the weight of dread, and the sheep seemed more at ease in their pen. Jack and Mary, however, still carried the emotional strain of the recent events. Despite their relief at solving the mystery, a lingering sense of guilt over suspecting Rocky lingered in their hearts. One afternoon, as the winter sun cast long shadows over the fields, Jack stood by the paddock, brushing Rocky's chestnut coat. The horse nickered softly, leaning into Jack's touch. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, boy?" Jack murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "And we doubted you." "I doubted you." Mary approached quietly, carrying a bucket of oats. "He's a good horse, Jack," she said, her voice gentle. "Better than we deserve sometimes." Jack nodded, running his hand along Rocky's mane. Lucas said Rocky tried to stop him, grabbed the lamb with his mouth to keep it safe. "Makes sense now, doesn't it? That wool in his teeth." Mary set the bucket down and stroked Rocky's neck. He was protecting them all along. "And we almost blamed him for something he'd never do." Jack's shoulders sagged as he exhaled heavily. "I should have trusted him. Rocky's been nothing but loyal to this farm and to us." As if understanding their words, Rocky let out a soft whinny and nudged Jack's shoulder. The gesture brought a small, bittersweet smile to Jack's face. "You're a better guardian than I'll ever be, Rocky." That evening, as the couple sat on the porch swing with cups of steaming coffee, they watched the fading sunlight wash over the farm. Rocky stood by the paddock gate, his silhouette strong and steady against the orange sky. "You know," Mary began, her tone contemplative, "the sheriff said something interesting when he called earlier." "What's that?" Jack asked, taking a sip of his coffee. "He said Lucas admitted that if it hadn't been for Rocky, he would have taken more lambs. Said the horse scared him so much he almost gave up after the first try." Jack chuckled softly, shaking his head. "That horse has more guts than most people I know." Mary leaned against him, her voice warm. "We should let people know what he did. Not just here on the farm, but the whole town. Rocky deserves to be recognized for what he is, a hero." Jack looked down at her, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're serious? A town hero? For a horse? Why not?" Mary replied, her tone playful but earnest. "Rocky's the reason we still have most of our lambs. The least we can do is share his story." Jack mulled it over, nodding slowly. "You might be onto something. Maybe it's time we show people how much Rocky means to us, and to this farm." In the weeks that followed, word of Rocky's bravery spread throughout the small Kansas town. Neighbors stopped by to visit, bringing treats for the horse and marveling at his calm, watchful demeanor. Carl, their nearest neighbor, was among the first to praise Rocky. "Never thought I'd see the day a horse would outsmart a thief," Carl said with a laugh. "You've got yourself a real gem there, Jack." The local paper even ran a story about Rocky, dubbing him the guardian of the Thompson farm. The headline brought a rare smile to Jack's face as he read it aloud to Mary at the kitchen table. "Maybe he's not just a horse after all," Jack joked, his voice carrying a hint of pride. "Maybe he's part of the family." "Not maybe," Mary corrected with a smile. "He always has been." That night, as the farm settled into its familiar rhythm, Jack and Mary stood by the paddock, watching Rocky graze peacefully under the stars. The events of the past few weeks had tested their faith in each other, in their farm, and in Rocky. But as they stood there, side by side, they knew one thing for certain. Rocky's place on the Thompson farm was unshakable, and his loyalty would never be questioned again. The morning after Rocky's story spread through town, Dr. Harris, the local veterinarian, arrived at the farm for a long overdue visit. A tall man in his 60s with a calm demeanor and a sharp eye for detail, Dr. Harris had been caring for the Thompson farm animals for years. He had heard about the recent events and insisted on checking Rocky to ensure he was in good health after his heroic actions. Jack greeted the vet by the barn, tipping his hat. "Morning, Document appreciate you coming out here. Morning, Jack, Dr. Harris replied, hoisting his medical bag over his shoulder. I hear Rocky's been busy playing sheriff around here. Let's see how he's holding up. Rocky stood calmly in the barn, his large, dark eyes following Dr. Harris as he approached. The horse snickered softly when Jack patted his neck, but there was an underlying restlessness in his stance that Dr. Harris immediately picked up on. He's been acting a little off, Jack admitted. More restless than usual. His belly's been swollen, too, but we thought it might just be stress from everything that's happened. Dr. Harris nodded thoughtfully as he began his examination, running his hands along Rocky's frame, checking his vital signs, and feeling for any abnormalities. Swelling like this can mean a lot of things, he said, his tone professional but kind. Could be diet-related, stress-induced, or something more internal. Let's check him out thoroughly. Mary watched from the barn door, her hands clasped tightly. He's been eating fine, but he hasn't been himself, she said. You don't think it's serious, do you? Dr. Harris offered a reassuring smile. We'll know soon enough. Let's not jump to conclusions just yet. After a series of tests and a careful review, Dr. Harris stepped back, his expression serious but not alarmed. Rocky's got colitis, he announced. It's an inflammation of the colon, likely caused by stress. Given what he's been through recently, chasing off intruders, the changes in the farm's routine. It's not surprising. Jack frowned, his concern deepening. Is it treatable? Absolutely, Dr. Harris said with a nod. He'll need a few weeks of a modified diet, more fiber, less grain, and some medication to reduce the inflammation. Rest will help, too. Rocky's a tough one. He'll bounce back. Mary exhaled in relief, stepping closer to stroke Rocky's neck. Thank goodness. We were so worried. Jack, still processing the diagnosis, looked at the vet. Doc, I need to ask, could the stress have been caused by how we doubted him? By us thinking he had something to do with the lambs disappearing? Dr. Harris tilted his head thoughtfully. Horses are incredibly perceptive, Jack. They pick up on emotions, tension, and changes in their environment. If Rocky sensed your unease or mistrust, it might have contributed. But don't beat yourself up too much. What matters now is how you care for him moving forward. Jack nodded solemnly, his hand resting on Rocky's shoulder. We owe him that much, and more. Over the next few weeks, the Thompsons followed Dr. Harris's instructions to the letter. Rocky's diet was adjusted, his workload lightened, and Jack spent extra time grooming and caring for him. The bond between man and horse seemed to deepen with each passing day. Mary often joined Jack by the paddock in the evenings, bringing slices of apple for Rocky as a treat. He's looking better already, she said one night. Watching Rocky munch contentedly, Jack smiled, his eyes soft. He's always been strong. Just needed us to show him we trust him. Dr. Harris checked in regularly, and each visit brought more good news. By the end of the month, Rocky was back to his old self, his eyes bright and his coat glossy. The swelling in his belly had disappeared, and his energy returned. The Thompsons' appreciation for Rocky grew even stronger after the ordeal. He wasn't just their protector. He was a part of their family, and they vowed never to let anything shake their trust in him again. Winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the Kansas plains, and with it came a sense of renewal on the Thompson farm. Rocky, now fully recovered, stood tall and proud in his paddock, his chestnut coat shining under the pale sunlight. The sheep, once agitated, grazed peacefully in the fields, their safety secured thanks to their unlikely guardian. Jack and Mary, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges of the past few weeks had tested their faith in their farm, in each other, and in Rocky. But they had emerged stronger, their bond deepened by the trials they'd faced together. One afternoon, Jack called Mary out to the barn. Got something I want to show you, he said, a hint of mischief in his tone. Mary followed, curious. Inside, Jack had hung a new wooden sign on Rocky's stall. The words, carved carefully by hand, read, Rocky, the guardian of the Thompson farm. Mary chuckled softly, her hand covering her mouth as she took in the sight. You've got a sentimental side after all, Jack Thompson. Jack grinned, running a hand over the sign. Figured he earned it. He's more than just a horse, Mary. He's family. Word of Rocky's heroism had spread far and wide, thanks in part to the story in the local paper. Neighbors came by to see the hero horse and share their own stories of animals showing extraordinary loyalty and bravery. Rocky, ever patient, tolerated the attention with a quiet dignity that only endeared him further to everyone who met him. The town decided to honor Rocky with a special day of recognition. Jack was reluctant at first. He wasn't one for attention, but Mary convinced him. It's not just about Rocky, she said. It's about showing people what loyalty and trust look like. It's about celebrating the bond we have with the animals who make our lives better. On a crisp spring afternoon, the town gathered at the local community center for the event. Families arrived with their children, many of whom brought small gifts for Rocky, carrots, apples, and even handmade cards. Rocky stood calmly beside Jack, his ears flicking curiously as the crowd buzzed around him. The mayor gave a brief speech, recounting the story of Rocky's protection of the farm and his role in exposing Lucas's theft. Rocky reminds us, the mayor said, that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes they even have 4 legs and a mane. When it was Jack's turn to speak, he cleared his throat awkwardly and used to being the center of attention. I'll keep this short, he began, his voice steady. Rocky's been with us for a long time. He's worked harder than any farmhand I've ever known and asked for nothing in return. When trouble came, he didn't run. He stood his ground. I'd like to think we can all learn a little something from him about loyalty and courage. The crowd erupted in applause, and Rocky let out a soft nicker, as if acknowledging their praise. Jack gave him a fond pat on the neck, his usual stoic expression softening with pride. As the event wound down, Jack and Mary stood by Rocky's side, watching his families trickled out with smiles on their faces. Think he understands all this fuss is about him? Mary asked with a smile. Jack chuckled. If he doesn't now, he will when he sees the pile of treats waiting for him back at the farm. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the Thompsons returned home. The farm, bathed in the golden light of dusk, felt more peaceful than it had in weeks. Jack and Mary sat on the porch, their hands entwined, watching Rocky graze contentedly in his paddock. You were right, Mary, Jack said quietly. Sharing his story, it mattered. People saw what he did, and they saw what he means to us. Mary rested her head on his shoulder, her voice soft. Rocky's more than a horse. He's a reminder of what's good in the world. Loyalty, courage, trust. They're worth holding on to. As the stars began to dot the sky, Rocky lifted his head, his ears flicking toward the sound of a distant coyote's howl. Jack smiled, tipping his hat toward the horse. Don't worry, boy. We know you've got our backs. The Thompson farm had faced its share of challenges, but its heart, embodied in a loyal horse named Rocky, beat stronger than ever. For Jack and Mary, the bond they shared with Rocky was a testament to the resilience of trust and the power of unwavering loyalty. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and if you watched until here, comment, I watched until here, and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that's showing on the end screen. It's really exciting.